When you asked us to look into this specific day in 1964, what struck me immediately was really how ordinary it started.
Right, just a completely normal day.
Yeah, exactly. Like, imagine for a second your daily commute. You know it entirely by heart, right?
Oh, sure. You don't even think about it.
Right. You know every turn, every stoplight, every pothole on the way home from school or work. You know exactly what the ambient noise of your neighborhood sounds like on a random Tuesday or Thursday afternoon.
The background hum of life.
Exactly. Now imagine you were navigating that exact, deeply familiar route, just trying to get home, only to suddenly find the streets completely empty.
Just deserted.
Yeah. The ambient noise it's gone. And within an hour, you find yourself trapped in the opening moments of a geopolitical earthquake.
Wow.
An event so profound that it would permanently redraw the map of the Western Hemisphere. You went to school in one reality, and, well, you are walking home into a literal war zone.
It's a staggering premise. And the thing is, it isn't a hypothetical. It is exactly what happened to one teenager on the Isthmus of Panama on January 9th, 1964.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have an extraordinary stack of sources today, custom-tailored to the documents and records you shared with us.
We really do.
Usually when we look at major historical shifts, treaties being torn up, borders being redrawn, we are looking at a very specific and, frankly, kind of dry type of paperwork.
Yeah, a lot of legalese.
Right? We are parsing through declassified diplomatic cables. We are reading official timelines from the State Department or human rights reports from international commissions like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the IACHR.
Which can be incredibly dense.
Very dense. And I mean, we have all of that today. We have the official geopolitical records of the Cold War. But what makes this deep dive so incredibly rare, so visceral, is what actually anchors all of this high-level statecraft.
Right, because the primary source material you've provided isn't just that high-level diplomatic paper trail. It is anchored by a first-hand eyewitness account.
Which changes everything.
It completely changes it. It's a personal memory from a compiler who lived through this exact event as a teenager. And that is really the spine of our discussion today.
Yeah.
We have the macro-level history of nations colliding, but it's told through the micro-level experience of a boy watching it happen from a hillside.
So let's unpack our mission for today. We are going to explore how a dispute over a high school flagpole, I mean, literally a single torn piece of fabric, sparked a 3-day crisis that history remembers as Martyrs' Day.
A profoundly tragic 3 days.
Yes, very much so. And we want to understand how this incredibly localized, seemingly adolescent conflict doomed the American Canal Zone. It forced the United States, arguably the most powerful nation on the planet at the time, to wake up and realize that holding a foreign territory in perpetuity was, well, an impossible, delusional dream.
And, that phrase, in perpetuity, is going to be central to everything we discuss.
Right, meaning forever.
Exactly. Forever, without end. That was the exact legal and diplomatic language used to justify the American presence in the Canal Zone. And forever, as it turns out, is a very fragile concept.
Yeah, it ended very suddenly in 1964.
It did.
To understand why a simple flag could start a fire that burned down forever, we first have to look at the world this teenager was living in. And it was an incredibly bizarre, bifurcated world.
Completely split.
We really need to look at life in the Canal Zone in the early 1960s because I don't think most people today realize just how strange this geographical setup actually was.
It was entirely unique. I mean, to set the stage geographically, if you look at a map of Panama from that era, the Canal Zone wasn't just a military base tucked away in a corner somewhere.
Right, it wasn't just an outpost.
No, and it wasn't just the waterway itself either. It was a 10-mile wide strip of land that ran right through the absolute middle of the Republic of Panama.
Just slicing it in two.
Exactly. Completely severing the country in half, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Yeah. And this 10-mile strip was operated entirely, exclusively by the United States.
It was essentially a massive U.S. government company town, but supersized.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It functioned as a piece of suburban America transplanted directly into the Central American tropics.
With all the amenities.
Right. It had its own police force, its own judicial system and courts, its own post offices, its own school system, and its own meticulously planned housing. And our eyewitness, the teenager whose count anchors our deep dive today, moves into this world in 1961.
Okay, so a few years before the riots.
Yes. His family relocates to the zone, specifically to a residential sector called Cardenas Village.
Now, Cardenas Village, that's government housing, right? It's where the bureaucrats and the specialists lived.
Correct. It was housing designated specifically for the staff of the Middle America Research Unit, or MARU,
Yep.
and the Federal Aviation Administration. His father works for MARU. And there's a crucial detail here about his father that we need to keep in mind for later.
Right, I saw this in the notes.
His father is a World War II veteran.
Right.
He is someone who has seen global conflict up close. He knows what a battlefield looks like.
So you have this family living in a U.S. government bubble, surrounded entirely by other U.S. government employees, a completely insular, English-speaking American community in the middle of Latin America.
Very isolated from the local culture.
Exactly. But here is where this specific teenager's experience diverges wildly from the typical narrative of someone living in the Zonians, as they called them, because instead of sending him to the U.S.-run schools inside the zone, the schools that were built exactly for kids like him, with American curriculums, his parents make a very deliberate and very unusual choice.
You do. They look at the educational options inside the zone, and they decide against them. Instead, they enroll him in Colegio de la Salle.
Which is a Panamanian school located completely outside the zone in Panama City proper.
Right. It is a profound parenting choice for that era.
Yeah.
Their reasoning, according to the source material, was to ensure he became truly bilingual and received a broader, more cosmopolitan education than the insular, heavily segregated Canal Zone schools could offer.
Which is admirable.
It is. But if you stop and think about the psychological effect of this dual existence on a teenager, it's staggering.
I can't even imagine.
This boy wakes up every morning in an American household, in a U.S. government housing sector, eats an American breakfast, and then he literally leaves his country.
Every single day.
He crosses an international border, he goes into Panama City, and he spends his entire day immersed in Panamanian culture, learning in Spanish, surrounded by Panamanian peers.
He is crossing a heavily policed international border twice a day just to go to high school. That alone would completely warp your sense of reality.
And because he is attending a Panamanian school, he isn't just learning a different language. He's learning history, geography, and civics from the Panamanian perspective.
Right.
This is where we see the absolute grinding friction of this geopolitical arrangement play out in a classroom setting.
I was reading through your notes on this, and there's one detail that I cannot get out of my head.
The textbooks.
Yes. In his classes at De La Salle, they use standard Panamanian history textbooks. And in these textbooks, when they discuss the geopolitical reality of the canal, they do not even refer to the United States by its actual name.
No, they refuse to print the words United States.
They call it the powerful nation to the north. That is the official textbook terminology.
The semantic weight of that choice is incredible. The powerful nation to the north.
So ominous.
By refusing to name the United States, the Panamanian educational system is making a profound political and psychological statement. They are highlighting the deep-seated resentment, the feeling of cultural erasure, and the massive asymmetry of power that Panamanians felt every single day on their own native soil. It reduces the U.S. from a diplomatic partner or even a neighboring country into a looming, nameless monolith. It turns America into a force of nature, a threat, rather than a nation.
It makes complete sense. It's like living next to an active volcano that dictates your entire life. You don't call the volcano by a friendly, familiar name. You just call it the threat.
That's a great way to think about it.
I was trying to think of how to contextualize this for someone listening who has never experienced a bifurcated country. It's essentially like this. Imagine you live in a house. It's your house. It's been your family's property for generations. You know every inch of it.
Right.
But one day, a massive, incredibly wealthy multinational corporation comes in and uses a century-old legal technicality to build a luxury gated community right through the exact middle of your living room.
Right through the center of the floor plan.
Exactly. They build a wall right through your hallway. They set up their own armed security guards in your kitchen. They bring in their own food, their own laws, their own flag. And you, the homeowner, the person whose family has lived on this dirt for centuries, are not allowed to cross your own hallway to get to your own bedroom without their explicit permission.
It's a complete violation of sovereignty.
You are treated as an impoverished outsider in the very center of your own home. You certainly aren't allowed to fly your own flag in your own hallway. That is what the Canal Zone was to Panama. It was a luxury gated community built right through their living room, held in perpetuity.
That analogy captures the ambient, suffocating tension perfectly. The Panamanian people were cut in half. If a Panamanian citizen wanted to travel from the northern part of their own country to the southern part, they had to cross through a foreign jurisdiction.
They had to show papers in their own country.
They had to submit to foreign police. And for the Panamanian students at De La Salle, looking at this American teenager in their classroom every day, they know he goes home to that gated community every night. They know he benefits from the wealth and the exclusivity of that occupying force.
I just wonder what that does to a teenager's worldview, to sit in a classroom and realize that the country your father serves, the country whose passport you hold, is viewed as a nameless, oppressive monolith by the kids you play soccer with and share notes with every day.
It's a heavy burden for a kid.
He had to have been walking a tightrope. He had a foot in the American bubble, where everything was safe and manicured, and a foot in the Panamanian reality, where the resentment was palpable.
It creates an incredibly unique vantage point. He is uniquely positioned to see the humanity on both sides of a dividing line that most people on either side never crossed.
Right.
He understood the Zonian mindset because he lived in Cardenas Village. He saw his neighbors as regular people going to work. But he understood the Panamanian grievance on a cellular level because he studied it every day.
He lived it with them.
He understood why the powerful nation to the north was a phrase laced with generational anger. He knew it wasn't just anti-American propaganda, it was a daily lived reality for his classmates.
So you have this simmering ambient tension of us versus them. It was a powder keg, just sitting there, baking in the tropical sun for decades. Everyone knows it's there. Everyone knows the resentment is building. And yet, in 1963, a seemingly minor diplomatic compromise, something intended to release some of that pressure, actually ends up providing the spark.
Yes. We need to look at the geopolitical pressures on Washington leading up to January 1964. The U.S. government, under President John F. Kennedy, recognized that this resentment in Panama was reaching a critical boiling point.
They couldn't ignore it anymore.
Exactly. And we have to remember the context of the era. This is the early 1960s. The Cold War is in full swing. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just happened in 1962.
So tensions are already sky-high globally.
The United States is terrified of communist influence spreading through Latin America. The absolute last thing Washington wants is a massive anti-imperialist uprising right on top of their most strategic global waterway.
It would be a disaster.
The optics of the Canal Zone. A wealthy enclave flying only the American flag in the middle of an impoverished Latin American nation were becoming a major diplomatic liability.
It's just bad PR on a global scale. You are handing the Soviet Union a propaganda victory every single day.
Precisely. So in 1963, President Kennedy agrees to a concession. It's largely a symbolic gesture, but an important one. The agreement states that from now on, both the United States flag and the Panamanian flag will fly together at civilian, non-military sites within the Canal Zone.
A dual flag agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, on paper, it sounds completely reasonable. A little olive branch to say, hey, we recognize we are guests here.
From Washington's high-level perspective, yes.
Yeah.
It was a minor concession to Panamanian sovereignty, an acknowledgement that technically the land still belonged to Panama, even if the U.S. controlled it.
Yeah.
But Washington completely misread the local psychology.
Yeah.
Because to the residents of the Canal Zone, the Zonians, this agreement was not a diplomatic compromise. It was seen as an absolute betrayal by their own government.
It's fascinating how disconnected the policymakers in D.C. were from the actual culture they created in the zone. And this is where we have to talk about Balboa High School.
Balboa High School was the flagship U.S.-run high school inside the zone. It was where the children of the Canal Company executives and administrators went.
The elite of the zone.
Right. And on January 7, 1964, the students at Balboa High decide to actively defy the Kennedy administration's diplomatic agreement. They take matters into their own hands.
Yeah.
They march out to the flagpole in front of the school, they raise the United States flag alone, and they physically stand guard around the base of the pole. They create a human barricade to prevent the Panamanian flag from being raised alongside it.
It's hard for me to buy that this was just teenagers being rebellious. You know, you don't stand guard over a flagpole like a soldier unless you're mimicking the adults around you.
That's a very sharp observation.
Kids don't usually care about diplomatic treaties unless their parents are screaming about them at a dinner table.
You're exactly right to point that out. These students weren't operating in a vacuum. They were reflecting the hyper-nationalist, entitled environment they were raised in.
Right?
The adult Zonians felt a deep, almost religious sense of ownership over the canal. In their minds, they had built it, they maintained it, they brought civilization to the jungle. They believed the canal was fundamentally American territory.
So any concession is a threat.
The idea of flying the Panamanian flag was, to them, the first step on a slippery slope toward surrendering the canal entirely. So the teenagers at Balboa High were acting as proxies. They were enforcing the cultural red lines that their parents believed Washington was too weak to defend.
But by doing that, by raising that flag alone and guarding it, they aren't just making a statement to Washington. They are sending a massive, highly visible insult directly across the border into Panama.
Absolutely.
They are practically daring the Panamanians to respond. And it only took 2 days for the response to arrive.
On January 9, the tension breaks. About 200 Panamanian students from a premier institute in Panama City decide that they've had enough.
Okay.
They organize a march. They leave the city, cross the border into the Canal Zone, and march directly toward Balboa High School. And they're carrying their own Panamanian flag.
Just 200 kids.
Right. Their stated intention, according to all the historical records, was simply to enforce the 1963 agreement. They want to march up to the pole, sing their national anthem, and raise their flag alongside the Stars and Stripes, exactly as the treaty stipulated.
Let's really paint the picture of this moment because it's vital to understanding how quickly this spirals out of control. You have 200 marching Panamanian students, and the sources make this explicitly clear. They weren't an armed militia.
No, not at all.
They weren't revolutionaries with rifles. They were high school kids. They were teenagers in their school uniforms carrying a piece of cloth, asserting their national identity on their own native soil.
It's essentially a clash of two student bodies. But in that moment, they're no longer just teenagers. They represent the full weight of their respective nations' psychologies.
The proxy war is playing out on the lawn.
Exactly. The Panamanian students arrive at Balboa High. They are met by a massive crowd of Zonian students and adults guarding the flagpole, and eventually by the Canal Zone police, who are vastly outnumbered and trying to manage an increasingly hostile crowd.
And then the inciting incident happens. The spark hits the powder. A scuffle breaks out around the flagpole. There's pushing, there's shoving, insults are thrown.
It gets chaotic very fast.
And in the middle of this chaotic physical struggle, the Panamanian flag is torn.
It's a moment of incredible historical resonance, how a single physical object becomes the avatar for an entire geopolitical conflict. That torn flag was not just a piece of fabric to the Panamanian students. It was the entire U.S.-Panama relationship materialized.
It was the metaphor made real.
To be turned away from flying their own flag on what is sovereign Panamanian land, and to have that flag physically torn by the very people occupying their country, it was the ultimate intolerable insult.
You can just feel the weight of that.
It crystallized decades of marginalization, poverty, and humiliation into one visceral, undeniable image. The torn flag was the absolute proof of everything they had been taught in their textbooks about the powerful nation to the north.
The news of that torn flag spreads backward into Panama City like wildfire. The students retreat, carrying this damaged symbol, and the anger just erupts. It stops being a student protest and instantly becomes a national uprising.
The whole city shifts.
The tectonic plates of history are shifting. But while this incredibly localized scuffle is happening at the high school, setting off alarm bells in embassies across the continent, our eyewitness teenager is completely oblivious.
He has no idea.
He's just trying to get home from his classes at De La Salle. He has no idea that his daily commute is about to become a war zone.
We are now moving into the late afternoon of January 9. Our teenager finishes his day in Panama City. He begins his usual mundane journey back into the Canal Zone. He heads toward the border, which locals colloquially refer to as the limits.
The limits. That is such a fascinating, evocative name for a border. It implies so much more than just a line on a map.
It implies the edge of civilization for the Zonians and the boundary of control for the Panamanians. It's a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. He approaches the limits near a very specific landmark known as the Tivoli Guest House.
I want to pause on the Tivoli Guest House for a second because the dossier points out a detail about its naming convention that perfectly encapsulates the petty, bureaucratic friction of the zone.
The naming of the Tivoli is incredibly revealing. It was a massive, beautiful, sprawling structure operated by the U.S. government right inside the zone, very close to the border.
Like a resort.
Exactly. It had ballrooms, dining rooms, suites. It was a grand hotel. But it was pointedly, officially, not called a hotel. The U.S. government insisted on calling it the Tivoli Guest House.
Because if they called it a hotel, it would inflame the Panamanians even more than it already did.
Right. The Panamanian hospitality industry viewed the U.S. government operating a massive, subsidized commercial hotel right on their border as a direct attack on their local economy.
It's unfair competition.
It was poaching their tourist and diplomatic trade. So, to avoid the political headache of competing directly and explicitly with Panamanian businesses, the U.S. authorities just played a semantic game.
A loophole.
They called it a guest house, pretending it wasn't a commercial enterprise, even though it functioned exactly like a luxury hotel. It's a perfect microcosm of how the U.S. operated in the zone, doing whatever they wanted, but wrapping it in bureaucratic euphemisms to maintain a facade of diplomacy.
So our teenager is crossing the limits right near this monument to American bureaucratic arrogance. And he immediately notices that something is deeply, viscerally wrong.
The environment has completely changed.
The usual bustling atmosphere of the border crossing, the traffic, the street vendors, the commuters rushing back and forth, it's entirely gone. The streets are completely, unnervingly empty.
It's the eerie silence before a massive storm. He makes it through the border and gets home to Cardenas Village. And the atmosphere inside his house is just as unsettling as the empty streets. He turns on the radio to see if there is news. Specifically, he tunes into the U.S. Army's Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, or AFRTS.
And what's playing on the radio is the detail that actually gave me chills when I read through his account.
Yeah.
Because it's playing nothing but classical music.
It is a detail that requires an understanding of military broadcasting to fully appreciate.
Right, because normally Armed Forces Radio is incredibly chatty. It's designed to boost morale. It's playing pop songs, jazz, the latest rock and roll records. You have DJs talking to the troops, giving shout-outs, making it feel like a slice of home.
Very high energy.
But suddenly, there are no DJs. There are no commercials. It's just uninterrupted, swelling classical music.
In a military or government broadcast context, a sudden, unexplained shift to uninterrupted classical music is the universal, chilling tell that a major crisis is actively unfolding.
It's like an emergency broadcast system, but subtle?
Exactly. It means the regular programming schedule has been entirely suspended. It means the civilian DJs have been ordered out of the booth or told to stay off the air. It is a holding pattern. When you are on a military base and you turn on the radio and hear Mozart or Beethoven playing endlessly without any announcements, you know that somewhere, high up in the chain of command, people are scrambling.
They're trying to figure out what to do.
They're locking down information while they figure out how to respond to an emergency.
Let's just sit with the visceral feeling of that for a second. Imagine the tension in that living room. You are a teenager. You've just walked through completely deserted streets, which never happens. You get home, the house is quiet, and the radio is just playing this somber, swelling string music. You don't know what's happening, but the entire environment is screaming at you that the world has just tilted on its axis.
And then his father returns home. He arrives from his job at MARU, which is located just up the hill at 4th of July Avenue, right along the border, essentially at ground zero for what is about to happen. And his father announces that a massive protest is forming on the avenue.
Now remember the detail we established earlier. His father is a World War II veteran. He is someone who knows what violence looks like. He knows what a deteriorating security situation feels like in his bones.
He's lived through it.
And I try to imagine the dynamic between the two of them in that room. A father who survived a global conflict, recognizing that the atmospheric pressure is dropping rapidly before a battle. And a son just trying to process why his mundane Tuesday commute has turned into a ghost town.
Driven by a mix of concern, perhaps a need to secure their workplace at MARU, or simply the very human instinct to understand what is happening in your own backyard, the father and son make a decision.
They don't just stay put.
They don't hunker down. They leave the safety of their home in Cardenas Village. They get in their car, drive back toward the border, park, and walk directly toward the epicenter of the tension.
They walk down to 4th of July Avenue, and this is where the grand historical record and the intimate personal memory collide in the most terrifying way.
They arrive at 4th of July Avenue exactly as the first U.S. troops from the local military garrisons are deploying to the border. The Canal Zone police have completely lost control.
That's too big for them.
They have been overwhelmed by the swelling, furious crowds of Panamanians reacting to the news of the torn flag, and the military has been called in to hold the line.
The source material gives us this incredibly vivid eyewitness memory from the teenager, and it's a sensory detail that you can't get from a dry diplomatic cable.
The bayonets.
Yes. He and his father are standing there on the avenue, and they watch the U.S. infantry line up. And they hear the distinct metallic snick of the troops fixing bayonets onto the ends of their M1 rifles.
The sound of metal locking onto metal. It is the definitive auditory signal of an escalation to lethal force. It means crowd control has failed, and close-quarters combat is anticipated.
But then there is this bizarre, terrifying pause. The troops have fixed their bayonets. They are holding their rifles across their chests, facing the gathering, screaming crowd across the avenue, and they just stand there. They are waiting.
They're waiting to be issued ammunition.
Let's talk about what that delay actually means logistically, because it is a chilling detail.
It highlights the absolute chaotic suddenness of the escalation. The U.S. military was scrambling to respond to a situation that had devolved far faster than their supply chains and logistics could handle.
They had the guns, but
They had the manpower, they had the physical weapons, but the actual live rounds, the bullets, hadn't caught up to the front line yet. It shows a command structure that is reacting in real time in a state of panic to a localized high school scuffle that is instantly morphed into a mass uprising. They are standing there with blades, waiting for bullets, facing thousands of angry citizens.
it's just a terrifying image. So the father and son realize they are standing literally in the middle of a deployment zone. They are in the way and they are in danger. They need a better, safer vantage point. So they start climbing up Ancon Hill, which is a massive geographical feature that overlooks 4th of July Avenue and provides a sweeping view of the border.
As they climb Ancon Hill, the riot explodes below them. The timeline shifts from unbearable tension to active, violent conflict. The crowds clash, projectiles are thrown, and then the gunfire erupts.
The teenager remembers the sound of the rounds beginning to fly overhead, the incredibly loud crack of the military rifles echoing up the side of Ancon Hill, the snap of bullets passing through the air near the foliage around them.
And this is where the father's military background becomes the deciding factor in their survival.
Yes, because if you're a civilian or a teenager, you might freeze. You might drop to the ground, but you might also try to peek over the edge to watch what's happening.
Human curiosity.
Right, you don't necessarily know the difference between a warning shot fired into the air and a fatal crossfire zipping past your head. But his father is a combat veteran. He immediately assesses the lethal reality of the situation. The second he hears the trajectory and the volume of those rounds, he turns to his son and tells him unequivocally, it is time to retreat.
He recognizes the audio signature of a battlefield. He knows the difference between a riot and a firefight.
It makes complete sense. It's like a veteran storm chaser versus an amateur. The amateur might stand out in a field and stare at a tornado forming because it looks incredible. You are mesmerized by the spectacle of the funnel cloud.
But the veteran knows better.
But the veteran storm chaser knows exactly which microscopic shift in the wind direction or which sudden drop in the barometric pressure means that the tornado isn't just forming, it is turning directly toward you. And the veteran knows that the only correct action in that moment is to turn around and run. The father knew the wind had shifted. He knew they were in the kill zone.
That is the perfect way to contextualize it. He knew that curiosity in that moment was fatal. So they scramble up and over the hill, moving out of the line of fire. They retreat safely back into the depths of the Canal Zone, away from the border.
But while they are retreating, finding safety in their gated community, the avenue below them is descending into what will become 3 relentless days of historical tragedy.
And as we move from the personal observation on the hillside to the broader historical record of those 3 days, we have to look at the immense human cost. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a sustained urban conflict.
The fighting spreads rapidly. It doesn't just stay localized at Balboa High or even on 4th of July Avenue. It runs all along the border between the zone and Panama City. It even spreads across the country to other areas like the city of Colón on the Atlantic side.
It engulfed the region.
The violence escalates hour by hour. It goes from pushing and shoving to stones being thrown at the police to Molotov cocktails being hurled at U.S. infrastructure. Buildings are set on fire, cars are overturned, and inevitably massive amounts of live gunfire are exchanged.
The human toll begins almost immediately. And we need to speak about this soberly because the first casualty of the conflict is a 19-year-old Panamanian student named Ascanio Arosemena.
Just a kid.
He is struck by gunfire and killed while reportedly trying to help evacuate wounded protesters. His death is the catalyst that gives the event its historical name, Martyrs' Day.
19 years old, roughly the same age, maybe just slightly older than the teenager who was watching the troops deploy from the hill.
Yeah.
And this is where we have to pause and look at the historical records you provided, specifically the diplomatic cables and the IACHR reports, because they are an absolute mess of contradictions.
They really are.
And we should explicitly state here, to you listening, we are not taking sides on this. We are strictly unpacking what the incredibly conflicting sources say. Because when you read the reports from both sides, it's like reading dispatches from two entirely different realities. The border ends up staying closed for about a month. But in the immediate aftermath, and truly even to this day, the diplomatic accounts of what happened during those 3 days are violently opposed.
The historical record is deeply fractured, and it reflects the geopolitical desperation of both nations. Let's outline the competing arguments because the U.S. and Panamanian narratives diverge sharply on the most fundamental facts of the conflict. First, there is the crucial question of who fired first and why.
Right. When you look at the Panamanian accounts, they argue that the U.S. military and the Canal Zone police used vastly disproportionate lethal force against what was essentially an unarmed or very lightly armed civilian protest.
That's their core assertion.
They argue that U.S. troops fired into the crowds unprovoked using heavy machine guns and rifles against people throwing rocks.
Conversely, the United States military and diplomatic accounts presented to the OAS and the IACHR argue that their troops were operating under extreme restraint. The U.S. claims they were fired upon first by trained snipers who had positioned themselves in the Panamanian crowd.
Snipers.
Yes, specifically inside high-rise buildings overlooking the avenue, like the Panamanian Legislative Palace. The U.S. maintains that their forces returned fire only in self-defense, targeting specific sniper positions to protect the residents and critical infrastructure of the Canal Zone from being completely overrun by a violent mob.
And then there is the fiercely disputed death toll. The most commonly cited numbers in neutral historical summaries are roughly 22 Panamanians and 4 U.S. soldiers dead, with hundreds on both sides suffering severe injuries from gunfire, tear gas, and blunt force trauma.
However, Panamanian historical accounts often suggest much higher tolls for their citizens, arguing that many injuries and deaths were either undocumented in the chaos or deliberately covered up by authorities.
Which is common in these kinds of conflicts.
It is. The official historical record explicitly acknowledges that a definitive, universally agreed-upon body count may never be settled. The fog of war in an urban environment makes precision nearly impossible.
There is also a secondary, deeply political debate over the nature of the protests themselves. The U.S. government initially suggested that while the initial high school clash over the flag was spontaneous, the subsequent mass riots were highly organized and inflamed by outside agitation.
They were looking for a scapegoat.
They heavily implied that communist organizers, potentially aligned with Fidel Castro's Cuba, were taking advantage of the chaos to stage a coup or seize the canal.
While Panamanian accounts, and indeed the vast weight of modern historical consensus, point to the violence as a genuine, spontaneous eruption of long-standing, deep-seated national grievance. It didn't need Cuban agitators. The torn flag, the decades of poverty bordering extreme wealth, and the arrogance of in perpetuity were more than enough to sustain 3 days of rage.
I was looking at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights file you put together for this. How do we, as people trying to consume and understand history, process an event where the two primary nations involved still cannot agree on the basic facts? Who started shooting? Were there snipers? How many people actually died? How do we find the truth when the reports are completely opposed?
It's the fundamental challenge of historiography. You have to look at the incentives driving the narratives. The IACHR was brought in to investigate, but their involvement highlights how incredibly difficult it is to establish objective truth when both sides have massive geopolitical incentives to shape the narrative.
Right.
For the United States, admitting to unprovoked, disproportionate slaughter of civilians would be a massive diplomatic disaster in the middle of the Cold War. It would alienate the rest of Latin America and validate every piece of anti-American Soviet propaganda. They needed the narrative of defending against armed snipers.
And for Panama, the narrative of the innocent martyrs is equally vital.
Exactly. For Panama, the Martyrs of January 9 became the foundational pillar of their modern national identity. Their sacrifice had to be absolute and unblemished by accusations that armed revolutionaries were hiding among them, shooting at soldiers.
It's about national mythology.
When national identity and superpower prestige are both on the line, the facts on the ground become intensely malleable. As researchers, we don't necessarily pick the winning narrative. We observe the space between them. We acknowledge the tragedy of the 22 and the 4, and we recognize that the ambiguity itself is a historical fact. The inability to agree is a symptom of the broken relationship.
That broken relationship is the true legacy of Martyrs' Day. The bullets eventually stopped flying after 3 days. The fires burned themselves out, the tear gas dissipated, and the avenue would eventually be cleared of debris. But the diplomatic shockwaves were only just beginning to cross the globe. Because while the physical border could be secured with barbed wire and troops, the diplomatic relationship between the two nations was fundamentally, irreparably severed.
Which brings us to the immediate, unprecedented diplomatic fallout. On the very same day that the violence erupted, January 9, while the fires were still literally burning on 4th of July, Panamanian President Roberto Chiari makes a monumental decision. He officially breaks off diplomatic relations with the United States.
We really need to pause and contextualize how massive that is. What does it actually mean logistically to break diplomatic relations in 1964?
It is the geopolitical equivalent of flipping over the table and walking out of the room.
Yeah.
It means all formal communication channels between the two governments cease. The embassies are closed, the ambassadors are recalled, the literal phone lines between the State Departments go dead. It means that U.S. citizens in Panama suddenly have no legal representation or consular protection.
That's terrifying for the people living there.
And for a small Latin American nation to do this to the United States during the height of the Cold War was an almost unheard of, incredibly bold and dangerous maneuver.
It forced the entire world to stop and pay attention. Washington couldn't just sweep this under the rug as a minor border skirmish when the host nation of their most strategic global waterway just cut the phone lines and essentially declared them a hostile entity.
Chiari's move was a masterstroke of leverage. He is saying, we will not even speak to you until the fundamental injustice of your presence here is addressed. Panama immediately takes its grievances to the international stage.
They didn't keep it quiet.
No, they don't just complain to Washington. They go to the Organization of American States, the OAS, and they demand the UN and the IACHR investigate. They internationalize the crisis so the U.S. cannot manage it quietly or bully them into submission.
And the U.S. is essentially frozen out. There is zero formal diplomatic contact for months. Relations are not restored until April 1964, and they are only restored after President Lyndon B. Johnson, who has just taken over after Kennedy's assassination and is dealing with a massive global portfolio, publicly signals that Washington is finally willing to sit down and negotiate the fundamental future of the canal.
And that is the hinge of history. That is the long-term macro-level impact of January 9th. This event, Martyrs' Day, is the definitive turning point in U.S.-Latin American relations. It is the exact moment the United States finally accepts that holding the Canal Zone in perpetuity is politically, morally, and logistically untenable. The illusion of forever is shattered by the reality of the riot.
Which is just a staggering historical irony, isn't it? Let's trace the cause and effect here. The Zonian teenagers at Balboa High School started a riot specifically to protect their exclusive right to fly the American flag.
Right.
They wanted to assert their dominance. They wanted to prove that the zone was forever American. And the direct, undeniable result of their actions was the United States realizing they had to lose the Canal Zone entirely. By trying to stubbornly hold on to the symbol of their control, they accelerated the loss of the actual territory.
It is a textbook example of unintended consequences. Their inflexibility broke the system they were trying to protect. This event directly sets the course for the decades of complex negotiations that will eventually culminate in the 1977 Trujillo-Carter treaties, which explicitly laid out the timeline for the complete handover of the canal and the dissolution of the zone back to Panama.
The physical landscape of the country literally changed to reflect this shift. 4th of July Avenue, the border street where the troops deployed and the shooting started, was immediately renamed by Panama. It became Avenida de los Martyrs, Avenue of the Martyrs, and the site of the flagpole at Balboa High School, the exact spot where the flag was torn, eventually became a memorial. The scars of those 3 days were written permanently into the maps.
So while presidents like Chiari and Johnson and international diplomats at the OAS were charting the grand geopolitical future of the Isthmus, rewriting treaties, and dealing with the macro-level fallout, we have to remember our eyewitness.
Right, the teenager.
Our teenage boy, who watched the bayonets deploy from the hill, because he is dealing with the immediate, highly personal, micro-level fallout of the crisis.
Let's bring it back down to the ground level. Let's look at the epilogue for the boy who watched it all. Because the border between Panama City and the Canal Zone remains closed and heavily militarized for about a month after the riots. The U.S. military has it completely locked down. Nobody goes in, nobody goes out.
Which presents a very practical, immediate problem for him. He lives in Cardenza Village, inside the zone. He cannot cross the limits to return to Colegio de la Salle in Panama City.
He's entirely cut off from his school.
Yeah.
And the timing is terrible because it's the end of the term. He cannot go back to take his final exams. His Panamanian classmates are mourning their dead, and his education is completely derailed by this international crisis. He is a boy without a school.
His mother, facing this reality, has to figure out a practical solution.
Hmm.
Her son needs to finish his education, so she attempts to enroll him in the U.S.-run junior high school inside the Canal Zone.
Which makes sense.
It seems entirely logical. They live in the zone, his father works for MARU, he is an American dependent. By all rights, he should be able to seamlessly attend the local government school.
But this is where the bureaucratic runaround begins. And it is so incredibly revealing of the Zonian mindset at that exact moment in history. The mother goes to the zone administrator for the public junior high, and the administrator flat out refuses to test the boy for placement.
He refuses to look at his transcripts from De La Salle. He actually demands that the boy repeat the 7th grade entirely.
And the reasoning he gives is just unbelievably petty. The administrator blames the mother to her face. He literally states that it is her fault for putting her son in a Panamanian school in the first place, and therefore she has to suffer the consequences of his lost academic year.
If we unpack what this epilogue reveals, it is profound. The junior high administrator's intensely punitive attitude toward an American family that dared to engage with Panamanian culture reflects the exact insular, superior mindset that ignited the riots just weeks prior.
It's the same entitlement.
The administrator is punishing the mother for breaching the bubble. It's a bureaucratic manifestation of the same toxic entitlement that made the high schoolers refuse to fly the Panamanian flag. The message is clear. You chose them over us, you stepped outside the gated community, so now we're going to make you pay.
It's so vindictive. It's middle management tyranny at its finest. But the mother's response is a masterclass in strategic resilience. She doesn't yell, she doesn't accept defeat, and she doesn't let her son lose a year of his life to this guy's ego. She realizes there is a loophole in the zone's educational monopoly. She knows that there is a Catholic school inside the zone, St. Mary's, run by the Sisters of the Sacred Heart.
So she goes back to the unhelpful, punitive junior high administrator, and she lays a very careful, incredibly smart trap.
I marvel at this when reading the account. It's brilliant. She goes into his office and asks him a hypothetical procedural question. She says, if my son enrolls at St. Mary's and he successfully graduates from the 8th grade there in June, can he then enter Balboa High School in September as a freshman?
She uses his own bureaucratic rules against him. Because Balboa High is the official feeder school for all the junior highs in the zone, including the Catholic one. It's a pipeline.
Right. And the administrator, caught in his own procedural web, stammers and has to agree he can't break the district rules. Yes, if he graduates St. Mary's, he is eligible to go to Balboa. He gives her the verbal confirmation. He thinks he's just brushing her off.
Having secured that guarantee, she takes her son to the administrator at St. Mary's. And the response there is completely different. The St. Mary's administrator listens to the geopolitical mess that has stranded this kid, looks at his situation, and simply says, let's test him.
Just a normal, rational human response. So they give him the placement test. He passes easily because he's had a rigorous education at De La Salle. He joins his age mates in the 8th grade at St. Mary's, and he graduates successfully that June.
And because of his mother's foresight, her refusal to be bullied, and her ability to navigate that petty bureaucracy, a year later, the boy walks through the doors of his new school.
He walks into Balboa High School as a student, the exact school where the flag had flown, the exact site where the scuffle broke out, the exact place where the spark was lit that nearly burned down his entire world. Isn't it fascinating how the grand, sweeping geopolitical conflicts of the day, the Cold War, treaties, sovereignty, military deployments, ultimately trickle down into arguments over middle school placement tests?
It perfectly illustrates how history is actually lived by people on the ground. We read about President Chiari breaking diplomatic ties or LBJ negotiating treaties, but the lived experience of that historical pivot is a mother arguing with a petty school principal about a math test. It brings all the massive narrative threads together, connecting the boy's personal, incredibly frustrating journey back to the larger historical shift.
Just imagine the surreal feeling for that boy. Walking the halls of Balboa High, he knows what happened there. He saw the troops fixing bayonets. He heard the gunfire cracking over Ancon Hill. He knows the human cost. He knows that his former classmates at De La Salle consider the institution he is now attending to be the ultimate symbol of an occupying force. He is walking those polished hallways knowing that blood was spilled and history was permanently altered just outside its doors.
He is a living bridge between the two realities that violently collided on January 9th. He contains both the Panamanian memory of the powerful nation to the north and the Zonian reality of Balboa High.
It really is an incredible journey we've taken today. Let's recap what we've unpacked from this incredible dossier. We started with a teenager navigating a bifurcated life, crossing the limits every day, reading textbooks that erased his country's name. We watched as a seemingly small diplomatic compromise by JFK over a flagpole was arrogantly defied by a group of high schoolers acting as proxies for their parents.
We followed the march of the 200 Panamanian students, the physical scuffle, the tearing of the flag, and the sudden, violent escalation into a national uprising. We stood on Ancon Hill and heard the metallic click of bayonets and the crack of gunfire, guided to safety by the instincts of a World War II veteran who knew a battlefield when he heard one.
We confronted the tragedy of Ascanio Arosemena and the fiercely disputed human cost of the 3 days of fire. We saw how the competing narratives in the IACHR reports reflect the desperate geopolitical needs of both nations. We saw President Chiari flip the diplomatic table, cutting the phone lines and forcing the United States to finally abandon the delusional arrogance of in perpetuity.
And finally, we followed the bureaucratic epilogue that led our eyewitness right back to the epicenter of the conflict at Balboa High School, thanks to a mother who refused to let an empire's collapse ruin her son's 8th grade year.
My final takeaway for you, listening to this, is a reminder that history isn't just made by presidents signing treaties in grand, quiet rooms. It's not just made by generals moving troops on a map or diplomats drafting cables. Sometimes history is made by high school students pushing back against an insult they can no longer tolerate. It is made by ordinary people whose daily commutes suddenly, violently intersect with the breaking point of an empire.
Is a profound, sobering reminder of the extreme fragility of the geopolitical systems we assume are permanent.
And on that note, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder long after this deep dive ends. We look at the borders on our maps, the treaties governing our international trade, the legal systems that structure our global reality, and we view them as permanent fixtures. We think they are carved in stone. But if a 10-mile-wide, heavily militarized zone, backed by nuclear weapons and held in perpetuity by the world's most powerful nation, could be completely undone by a single torn flag at a high school look at the world around you today? Which of our seemingly permanent, unshakable geopolitical realities are actually just one torn piece of fabric away from unraveling entirely?